Good afternoon once again. You have the same chair here, but different speakers. So this is the second panel that we'll have today. We will cover different grounds. We're three speakers here and another speaker via Skype. We'll start first with Raja Al-Khalidi on my left. Raja will talk about the structural transformations of the Palestinian economy after Oslo. Raja is a developmental economist, works for so many years, between 1985 till 2013, with the UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Currently, he lives and works as an independent researcher in Palestine. So Raja, please have 20 minutes to address the complex issue of transformation.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Mandy for involving me in this project and the LSE for giving us a chance to air it out a little bit in the real world. I did a paper which really tries to summarize 20 years of the Palestinian economy's progress or lack thereof under the Oslo regime. And in doing so, of course, I covered quite a lot of ground, which I won't be able to talk in detail about, but I will at least try and pass through the main milestones, if you wish, or the main issues that I've dealt with in the paper, but focusing more on the broad analysis and findings that my own experience and by rewriting this paper I've come to conclude about how much structural transformation there has been and what sort of structural transformation of the economy. But I will avoid talking too much about the economy, even though we are in the home of many of the policy prescriptions that created the disaster that is the Palestinian economy today. But in any case, I was, working in the UN, I've learned to balance my words and not mince my words, but basically balance my analysis. And we used to say that I used to be responsible for writing an annual report on the Palestinian economy, which was basically by mandate intended to be a report that criticized the Israeli occupation's impact on the economy. But we always used to say that a successful report is one that draws criticism equally, or at least both from the Israelis and the Palestinians. In that spirit, I asked Mandy yesterday whether she, given the area covered in the paper and the nature of the audience, whether I should bash the Israelis, the donors, or the Palestinians. And so she said, well, in your style, I would hope you bash them all. So, hoping that I'm able to do that, I'd like to read, really, if you don't mind, and then briefly note some of the other issues. But we've heard this morning about a number of, or this earlier session about a number of strategic defeats, if you wish, at least failures to achieve victory, suffered by the Palestinian National Project over the past 2 decades, and they've been very well documented, these strategic defeats, and they're increasingly acknowledged as very much new facts on the ground. And especially I'm thinking, before talking about the economy, the phenomenal expansion of Israeli colonies and related infrastructure throughout the territory, the iron fist security control exercised by Israel throughout the occupied territory and policed, in fact, very conveniently in some areas of the West Bank by the PA itself, as well as, of course, the physical, legal, and political separation of Gaza and East Jerusalem, as we've heard very succinctly, very, very adequately from Mansour, from the rest of the occupied territory in the West Bank. However, it is less widely accepted that the same period has witnessed a similar degree of failure in the performance of the Palestinian economy and in development policy making, in fact. Indeed, the conventional wisdom among most Palestinian and Israeli policy makers and elites, no less among international donors and circles, and peace process advocates, is that economic growth is generally impressive, that individual prosperity is increasingly evident, and that Palestinian economic and institutional development is truly underway. Within this narrative, and notwithstanding occupation and notwithstanding the absence of sovereignty, the Palestinians have rarely had it so good, and should be able, I think in the view of many international observers and public opinion, what are they complaining about? And they should really be able to acquiesce in being able to enjoy the fruits of economic peace instead, and postpone, if need be, further until the Israelis agree to their national self-determination. So it's true that the balance of power in the Israeli-Palestinian struggle might be so asymmetric as to preclude such national self-determination for the foreseeable future. However, within this logic, there is no reason to expect capital or markets to remain dormant, as long as the former is an acceptable second best, the former, namely economic peace, is an acceptable second best path for an emerging Palestinian middle class and the national interests as understood by the ruling power elites of the PA regime. In fact, for 20 years, the PA has declared its adherence to the principles of an open, free market economy. This is enshrined in the basic law of the Palestinian Authority, even within the constraints of prolonged military occupation, settler colonial aggression, unfettered capital penetration of very vulnerable and dependent captive populations and markets. The outcome has been disastrous for the structure and for the structure of the putative national Palestinian economy, as they call it. They even have a ministry of the Palestinian national economy, and its development prospects, its social fabric and values, natural resources, and overall national economic security. And today, the Palestinian economy features even more than it did in 1994, when the beginning of the Oslo period supposedly ushered in opportunities for change and improvement. We still have a significant structural deformation in terms of the roles of the different sectors and their articulation between each other. We have clearly identifiable and statistically monitored channels of trade dependency and of resources extraction that track the path of Israeli liberalization. So as Israel's economy liberalizes, so has Palestine's. And as Israel's economy becomes increasingly sophisticated, so are certain sectors opened up for Palestinian operation. We have a largely ineffective, if not parasitic, public sector that has ceded the way to private enterprise while maintaining a strong internal security ethos. And I say parasitic not so much out of opinion, but if, as has been currently rumored, they are able to relieve 70,000 people out of public payroll without that hurting, then it makes you wonder what exactly is going on in terms of institution building. Growing economic, social, and regional inequalities and disparities, and I focus on regional in particular, but also class differentiation. And of course, a range of neoliberal economic policies and values that undermine the options for a viable development strategy for an independent Palestinian state were to somehow emerge. It is only natural and correct to apportion primary blame for this state of affairs between the obvious external suspects, Israel, the donor states, and the international financial institutions. But no doubt the PLO and the Palestinian leadership bear their share of responsibility for having led and locked the Palestinian people into the Oslo cage, while increasingly unable to fulfill their role as public authorities that should be concerned with ensuring the welfare and prosperity of the community as a whole. Indeed, a whole class of Palestinian Authority functionaries who are dependent upon the status quo for their daily bread, an energetic professional and commercial class which is divorced from politics and which seeks a normal lifestyle and the political system wedded to the idea of a peace process with Israel, all of these elements have a stake and a responsibility in the current state of economic policy and the acquiescence in a liberal market and governance model that has delivered neither communal development nor national liberation. Various sources have related this story partially and at different points over the years, but with hindsight today, we can recount it with greater clarity and candidness, and indeed with a sense of closure. One UN institution, UNCTAD, that contributed to monitoring and investigating the transformation of the Palestinian economy since 1985, is a consistent source which I've used in this paper in reference to documents produced over the years that, in fact, I won't say are not prophetic, but it's just by reading them today, you see how little really has changed. Certainly the standard concepts and tools for measuring and analyzing the growth and development of sovereign economies are inherently inadequate to describe an economy under prolonged occupation, and they can only paint a limited picture of the Palestinian reality. The most recent efforts, especially favored by the international community, have attempted, and we heard, thank you, Mandy, have attempted to analyze the Palestinian economic dilemma in terms of conventional institutional economics and generic concepts such as good governance and institution building, or more dubious themes of state in the making and statehood readiness. This latter theme, as we heard from the work of many of our colleagues, Ala and others, characterized much of the 2012 PA economic policy making, public investment, and national or regional level planning. And its predominance largely served to divert Palestinian collective efforts away from mobilizing to end occupation, and instead in the direction of liberal goals such as the rule of law, safeguarding property rights, good citizenship, private enterprise, and operation of the free market, as if such a thing could exist in the warped Palestinian context. Other analyses have searched, and I hope to be able to say that I've contributed to these other analyses, have searched for appropriate frames of references and concepts that better address Palestinian realities, such as the economics of settler colonialism, de-development, or the economic impact of prolonged occupation. These approaches have, however, been unable to coalesce, and this I'm addressing again to my colleagues like Ala and Tawfiq, however much we've been able to, I think, correctly criticize and deconstruct the narrative, we have nevertheless been unable to penetrate the mainstream narrative of a state-building process which is devoid of independence or sovereignty and which is still maintained by the PA and the international community. However, the failure since 2008 to impose Palestinian statehood, be it through institution building, diplomatic maneuvers, or waging lawfare, gives greater explanatory power to the alternative critical analyses today and to their relevance in addressing future challenges. Now, the paper goes on in several sections to look at the following issue. The first section that I really think is a bit economic history is about the PLO's embrace of globalization and how the Paris Protocol came to be. And this is a story which combines a constant continuity in Israeli policy, or Israeli strategies towards the Palestinian economy. As I say here, there is no Israeli policy towards the Palestinian economy. Rather, there is only one policy, which is that of maintaining occupation of the territory, including through economic strategies. So some of the economic strategies we've heard of recently, economic peace, but in fact this is just a new version of something that was started in the 1980s by both the Israelis and the Americans, called improving the quality of life, and really we've had various versions of this strategy over the 20 years. And Oslo produced something called the Paris Protocol, which itself is very much part of that strategy of pacification. So 20 years later, the protocol remains the economic law of the land, and it reinforces the adverse growth path within which the West Bank and Gaza economies remain locked. The protocol's terms and operation and the dependency that it perpetuates have been the subject of growing criticism since the 1990s from a number of agencies, Palestinian and Israeli economists. However, the PLO's determination, even today, to not repudiate the Paris Protocol and its either its de facto or de jure validity has yet in itself become yet another stumbling block on the path to achieving Palestinian economic viability and development. I then talk a little bit about the transformation of PLO economic thought from Beirut to Oslo to Ramallah, and compare the sort of approach to economics that the PLO had adopted until Oslo, which was very much one of the public sector, an economy that was productive in traditional sectors and reliant on its own capacities, and which could an economy which could address the imperatives of disengagement from the economic domination of Israel. So throughout the PLO eras, in Beirut and Tunis, Palestinian public economic institutions continue to operate as a sort of government in exile for the Palestinian people inside and outside their homeland. But within little more than a decade, the PLO had signed off in Paris on an economic policy package within a limited self-government deal with Israel that effectively aborted the plans and possibilities for an independent Palestinian economy, and instead enshrined a free market economy designed in line with the spirit of globalization and trade liberalization of that period. One should not ignore in this period class formation processes, but I'd just like to say a few words here about much of the public ire and criticism that has been directed at PA economic policies under Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, especially in 2012, and how some economists, including myself, have argued that Palestinian neoliberalism intensified and took a new turn under that regime. But there are also legitimate grounds for questioning whether the so-called Fayyadism in its economic dimension is only a higher stage of Arafatism, insofar as the latter had endorsed without much consideration the economic arrangements concluded with Israel and Paris that the former, Salam Fayyad, simply took to their logical technocratic conclusions. Indeed, in response to his critics, Salam Fayyad himself publicly emphasized that he is not the one who negotiated the Paris Protocol, and he should not be held responsible for its flaws. After all, the Fatah PLO economic project was never socialist, and its economic institutions aspired to operate according to market criteria. The PA under Fayyad may have witnessed a greater consolidation of financial functions under the Ministry of Finance, which is a reform largely instigated by Israel and the donors after 2002. However, the core economic philosophy and policies of the PA have been constant for the past 20 years, and even as policymakers may have sought greater liberalism in more recent years and moved away from the Arafat economic governance mode. I also talk about the conditions that brought rise to the Paris Protocol and why it was that I believe the PLO signed on the dotted line without really worrying too much about some of the details, which Diana referred to. One of the most important ones is the manner in which the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority has shrunk from what is written in the Paris Protocol, the West Bank, including Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, to basically areas A and B. I won't go into that because that whole, I'm watching the clock, there actually 7 minutes. So even in the best possible scenario of a benevolent Israeli occupation, the PA had conceded among the compromises of Oslo to permit the segmentation of the West Bank into zones of supposedly full Palestinian A, shared B, and solely Israeli C jurisdiction. This, in fact, spelt an early death for any serious possibility of ensuring a contiguous or cohesive Palestinian economic development effort that might set the scenes for sovereignty and statehood or create conditions for an end to occupation. And since then, PA planners have gone through excessive contortions to explain why they didn't properly examine maps at the time, or signed off on the zoning in 1995, or that they had expected Israel to cede the bulk of Area C by 1999, or that now, in 2014, the time finally had come for the PA to initiate a dedicated program for the benefit of Area C as a priority development zone. This never took place, however. So really, the Palestinian people have inherited a political regime and leadership that continues to retain authority over their lives, and which few appear willing to contest the risk changing despite all its shortcomings. So deep has grown public illusion with politics, with those in power, and with prospects for achievement of national rights. Now, under the structural transformation part of the paper, which is the core of the paper, and the shape of the PA free market economy under colonial domination, I compare, again, the way that we saw the economy in the early 90s, and in fact, from the wording that you could be writing about today, and I go on to talk about aggregate economic demand and performance, the relationship of domestic to non-domestic sources of income, the manner in which GDP in terms of aggregate demand is spread between different components, the role of the degree of private investment, its role, and other aspects of the supply side of the economy, and the inexorable rise of the services economy at the expense of Palestinian agriculture and industrialization. A separate section talks about Israeli-Palestinian economic relations and in particular the channels of dependency and resource extraction, both in terms of the trade with and through Israel and fiscal capture, as well as East Jerusalem economy, out of time, out of place, is similar to the analysis that we heard from Mansour, and some other aspects of under the radar Palestinian economic or Palestinian economic activity, which is not really so much recorded in official statistics. And one example I've given is the increasing Palestinian trade between Palestinians in the north of the West Bank and Palestinians in Israel, and the extent and the manner in which this is actually reinforcing both the Palestinian economy of the northern West Bank, but also it's like nerve endings that had been cut off and are reestablishing contact after 60 years of separation. So this is part of a different research work that I've been doing on the regional economies of Palestine and the manner in which they square off against the Israeli Jewish economy and the prospects for the linking up of these different economies. So as not to go over my allotted time, let me just finish with the next few minutes. Over and above, I was asked also to speak about the future, so let's talk about the future. Over and above the perpetuation of the myth of the dual economy of Palestine and Israel, among the many failings of academic Palestinian and international experts on the Palestinian economy for the past 2 decades, this author included, is the ease with which they succumb to, in better times, to the temptation of planning for the day one or the day after that has yet to arrive. This was mainly based on so-called assumptions that Israel was also truly planning for such a day and not simply entertaining Palestinian wishful thinking about it. The number of blueprints, schemes, plans, models, mock agreements, laws, developmental policies and strategies designed and published as books, reports or articles since Oslo for the future Palestinian state is truly mind-boggling. And indeed, they continued to be commissioned and presented at the Kenyon Institute a few months ago. I participated. So they all share at least three important features. None of them have gotten us a step closer to day one, assuming that it will exist. All of them are based, except for mine, on outdated theories, meaningless borders, and geophysical configurations, as well as utopian political assumptions. And finally, Israeli planning and policy making has hardly taken note of any of them. So these are the hard truths that should not be ignored. It would thus be disingenuous to attempt at this stage of rediscovery and reinterpretation of the Palestinian economic development story to offer policy recommendations for reversing the trends and realities described in my paper. Indeed, we must first contemplate whether we have actually reached the famous point of no return that Meren Ben-Venisti and King Hussein bin Talal warned back in the early 1980s was irreversible, that this Jewish settlement, as Jewish settlement intensified in Jerusalem and the West Bank. There are few credible signs that the disintegrative path that has now become evident between the disconnected Palestinian economies and regions will somehow be reversed in favor of spontaneous Arab economic unity within the broader Israeli economic union that it exists, that these economies exist. Much less that these different levels and channels of unequal independent exchange could yet yield sustained growth and real welfare or development gains for the Palestinian people who have been catching up with the so-called catching up and converging with the Israeli, well, supposedly converging and catching up with the Israeli economy for over 80 years now, and it doesn't seem to happen 1 minute. So one possible conclusion, not a happy one, is that alongside political stasis or meager gains, the process of incorporation without integration of the Palestinians into the Israeli envelope will continue and become structurally enforced. In such a scenario, indigenous Arab economic resistance to Judaization and Zionization cannot be effectively mounted as political and legal division constrains the potential for unified Palestinian action. Finance and capital, meanwhile, creating transnational bonds, distinct Arab national economic interests become blurred, and co-optation and collaboration becomes the norm rather than the exception. This sort of outcome is not as unlikely as many observers would like to believe. Indeed, it is being realized today at many points of Israeli-Palestinian economic contact, in cross-border commerce towns in the West Bank, like Na'alin and Beit Awa, around Israeli settlements in the Jordan Valley and the Ahwar, and in the open areas of the West Bank ceded to the building of new Palestinian residential cities, as well as in the markets and municipal and social service facilities of Jerusalem. But if an opportunity does exist or might arise to reconnect the Arab economic system of Palestine in a manner that reinforces national self-determination, regardless of statehood, even without statehood, then it is clear where the priorities lay for action by Palestinian national capital and by Palestinian public policy. No blueprint is really needed if there is a will to act, and the various forms of economic resistance, if pursued as a complementary strategy to others, could encompass a range of measures and Palestinian initiatives, even within the context of continued occupation. And in concluding, I talk about examples in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Gaza, in Israel, of the sort of realistic, if you wish, policy measures that could be that could be pursued even under occupation, that would not only relieve to a certain extent the de-development of these cantons, but actually promote their integration and cooperation in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roger. Lots of food for thought, and thank you for being very well with time. Dimi, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Excellent, and we can see you.
Can you?
Yes.
Hello.
Hello. If for any reason the network is not very clear, so we will just hear your voice, but it's so great to see you, and thank you for being with us now. Dimi Reader is a journalist and a writer, and he's also an associate fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations, ECFR. Demi will tell us what's happening in Israel after 20 years of Oslo. So you have 20 minutes to tell us all of that.
Yeah, so, so as the title of today's event suggests, the aim of the paper is to take Pulse in Israel 2 decades after Oslo. Now, unlike the work of some of my colleagues, and many of them focused on specific aspects of the situation on the Palestinian side, my talk will be in very broad strokes, as I do have to cover 20 years in 20 minutes. It will consist of 4 parts. What led Israel to the Oslo Accords, the Israeli reasons for the Accords not developing into a full-fledged peace process, where we are now, and where we're likely to go from here. And if connection breaks or if I speak too fast, trying to cram 20 years in 20 minutes, please signal. From the Israeli perspective, the Oslo Accords were born both out of pressure and out of opportunity. The first Intifada meant that the political economy of the occupation, as it was managed until then, needed to change. Strikes and unrest undermined the cheap labor market, and direct trade between Israelis and Palestinians stagnated. Domestically, public opinion was agitated by the security costs of the occupation, and even briefly, the moral and political strain of maintaining it. As a result, there was a brief window in which the public was amenable toward the prospect of peaceful separation. Internationally, the collapse of the Soviet Union dislodged the prospect of a Palestinian state from the Cold War framework, which played a role in Western stalling on this front. And finally, diplomatically, Israel identified an opportunity of engaging with traditional representative of the Palestinian people, the PLO, at a time when the organization's political capital was particularly low. Now, as we all know, the Accords were meant to be an interim framework, preparing the ground for negotiations of a comprehensive final status agreement. Much like the occupation, which began as a temporary situation of war and has become permanent in all but name, the temporary Oslo Accords cemented into a permanent framework, which by now looks as close to a two-state solution as we are ever likely to get. On the dynamics of how this occurred on the Palestinian side, I will defer to my Palestinian colleagues. I myself will touch briefly on 3 or 4 factors that first stalled and then brought down the process on the Israeli side. First, the framework itself was fundamentally flawed in that it focused on one particular actor and on its own political survival as much as or more than on inclusive leadership. It's instructive here maybe to step back and look at the peace process that took place concurrently with Oslo in Northern Ireland. In Belfast, there was a great effort invested by mediators to ensure that the workable maximum of factions on either side was represented, to make sure negotiators had the greatest possible mandate from their communities. This involved alternately coercing and cajoling Sinn Féin and the IRA, a prospect that generations of British and Unionist politicians found unpalatable. The gain from this effort, however, was that with the inclusion of the largest paramilitary organization of the conflict in the talks, dissident organizations found themselves completely marginalized. When one such faction attempted to derail the agreement with the Bon Binoma, the political and public backlash was such that it effectively ended the prospect of armed opposition for what is now coming close to a generation. In Israel, by contrast, the insistence was to talk to only one Palestinian faction, which, despite its historical mandate, was relatively removed from many of the events of the First Intifada, and to task that Palestinian faction with quieting the situation on the ground on Israel's behest. In Northern Ireland terms, what Israel has done was the equivalent of locating the leadership of the official IRA and pouring arms and funds into police all the other factions. It didn't work in Ireland, and it didn't work in Israel-Palestine. Instead of creating incentives for the broad spectrum of Palestinian political and paramilitary movements to invest themselves in the peace process, this decision is made an existential need to derail it, which they proceeded to do to a spectacular and, on the Israeli side, to a pretty horrific effect. The manner in which dissidents chose to derail the process is the second factor in the collapse on the Israeli side. The political violence of the 90s and 2000s has been overwhelmingly directed at the softest targets. Not only civilians, but civilians who use public transport, shop in outdoor markets, or live in communities inside the occupied territories or in close proximity to them. In other words, the lower middle class and the working poor, the largest and fastest growing sectors of Israeli society. While those living in settlements were not likely to support the partition-based peace process to begin with, the public and created an irreconcilable contrast between the lofty rhetoric of the process and the grim reality on the ground. Thirdly, a similar contrast between rhetoric and practice was happening on the Israeli side. Much as the Netanyahu government is doing now, the Rabin Peres government sought to increase settler presence in the occupied West Bank. It was helped by the influx of new immigrants, overwhelmingly from the former Soviet Union. Severe cutbacks to public housing within the Green Line and the encouragement of construction beyond it directed a disproportionate chunk of that influx into the settlements. The construction of settlements did little, of course, to persuade the Palestinian public in general, and the dissidents in particular, that the process held any real promise for the occupation's end. These three factors combined into a fourth, massive rise driven both by economy and by nationalism in the volume and clout of the settlement movement, and the corresponding collapse of the secular, somewhat more liberal metropolitan elites. When Paris and Rabin embarked on their venture, they could feel reasonably confident that if some limited evictions came to pass, they would be challenging, controversial, but ultimately successful, much as the eviction of the Sinai settlements a decade earlier. By the time the tenure of the government has run its course, Rabin was dead at the hand of a settler militant, and the settler movement was well on its way to become not merely a player in the Israeli political sphere, but a bedrock of a new cultural and political hegemony on the rise. Around the same time, the old secular elites who had brought the Oslo negotiators to power and who betted their less societal capital on partition, began a long and inglorious retreat, which is still taking place today. The retreat is driven by a great complex of processes, maturation of long-held frustrations among Jewish minorities, long discriminated and mistreated by these elites, and the channeling of these frustrations into support for the elite's traditional opponents, the nationalist right. The growth of a new middle class among these Jewish minorities, the squeezing of these minorities and of new immigrants into the settlement project, which discouraged them from support for partition, and the not uncommon reaction to the escalation in the violence on part of the liberal elite itself, disengagement from political life and in some cases immigration. So where are we now? The Likud and its offshoots have been in power for all of the present century, leading 5 governments in 15 years. Labour played second fiddle to most of these governments, to no observable constructive effect, until around 2010, when it was unceremoniously dismissed. It has sat in opposition since. In the last elections, it enjoyed a brief revival of sorts, but it should be remembered that revival has come at the expense of other liberal parties. The nationalist and liberal blocs have barely budged. Netanyahu's majority might be slim, but he enjoyed the support of a Trojan horse in the shape of Avigdor Lieberman's nationalist party in the opposition. And contrary to estimates in the immediate aftermath of the last elections, it seems this government will be as stable as any, if only because none of its members has any advantages alternative to keeping it where it is. As you will have heard, I imagine, several times during today's conference, settlement numbers have increased to close to 500,000. This means that not only is the settler population very difficult to displace for partition's sake, but also that statistically speaking, nearly all Jewish Israelis now have relatives in settlements, friends and colleagues in settlements, or settlement comrades from their formative years of military service. The proportion of Israeli settlers and their supporters in institutions of state has also been increasing. Much discussed study found that the ratio of settlers among infantry officers went up from about 2% in the early 90s to nearly 30% in 2008. And I'd be very surprised if the numbers haven't increased substantially since. The same is true about public servants, members of the judiciary, teachers, lawyers, journalists, and so on. This isn't about a settler conspiracy to take over an otherwise benign and liberal society. It's a much more organic process of change in an already nationalist and religious society, spurred on by catastrophic mismanagement of government and diplomacy by dwindling liberal elite. These years have seen an interesting dynamic evolving in public attitudes to the peace process. Like most communities, Israelis arguably desire quiet stability and prosperity. Therefore, they are quite amenable to the idea of a peace agreement. As a community overwhelmingly committed to a very rigid idea of a nation state, they are keen to retain hegemony in all the institutions of that state. Therefore, they are also quite amenable in theory to the idea of political separation from the other community contesting the same space. But it's also a community braced by genocidal trauma, when well within living memory, and a trauma that has been called on, sometimes quite callously, to explain many more recent political developments, from Israel's border wars to negotiations with Iran. And therefore, for Israelis, hegemony is completely conflated with survival. And having been braced by the disastrous peace process, Israelis could not be least amenable to the different risks they would need to accept in order for the process to be completed. The result is, if you look at the opinion polls of the past 20 years, that while a pretty stable majority of people profess to support the two-state solution, a majority also opposes compromises on any of the core issues of the conflict, from Jerusalem to refugees. Similarly, polls tell us that the less chances of a success a negotiating effort is perceived to have, the more support it will enjoy among Israelis, and vice versa. The more chances there seem to be that negotiations will result in change to the status quo, the more apprehensive Israelis become. This rather distant approach has been reflected in the political discourse. For almost 2 decades, the broad spectrum of Israeli politics endorsed support for the two-state solution in principle, while either avoiding it or deliberately undermining it in practice. The brief embrace of the two states by the Israeli center-right should not inspire us to think that the implementation of partition is a matter of wall-to-wall consensus. Firstly, nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come and gone. And secondly, the Israeli right has openly repudiated its support for partition in the last elections, in case every policy decision undertaken in the last decade and a half didn't spell the message clearly enough. The left, meantime, supported almost every use the right has made of Israel's military, which destroyed its credibility among most Palestinians, and has muted its support for actual partition as too toxic a flag to raise in any political campaign. In the latest peace program presented by the Labour Party, there is an express commitment not to partition Jerusalem, which really tells you much of what you need to know about the future of the Oslo program. Finally, the last 5 years or so have been a period of remarkable stability for Israel, militarily and economically. Militarily, the conflict with the Palestinians boiled down to a minimum, with the occasional flare-ups in Gaza serving only to entrench Israelis in the conviction that the diplomatic track is no longer tenable. Economically, Israel escaped the worst of the global recession, although here the word stagnation appears to be more apt than stability. Cost of living grew, wages stayed the same, and the resulting backlash of popular unrest in 2011 diverted attention even further from the conflict. It opened up a new field of politics with much greater potential for mobilization and room for maneuver than the stagnated conflict with the Palestinians. The result is that the conflict is barely discussed in any substantial way, whether in the day-to-day or during elections. It has also given delight to many of the threats and prophecies of those opposing the occupation. Israelis have been told they can't have security and prosperity without peace, yet they do. They've been told the world will exact the price for them for the occupation, yet the world did not. And they've been told that whatever stability they enjoy cannot last for long, but it's lasted for nearly half a century, and still going strong. Finally, the ever-growing unrest in the rest of the Middle East, from which Israel has been, by and large, mercifully excluded, is putting Israelis off any attempt to open up to the region or change anything in the status quo. So we're to the last part. How am I doing for time, by the way, Anna?
You have 7 minutes.
Oh, terrific. No good news, unfortunately. Having drawn such a monolithic picture of the present, I should probably begin my discussion of the future with a couple of caveats. First, the status quo is considerably more fragile than it seems. The conflict is suppressed, not addressed, and warlike jingoism is still the safest currency in Israeli political discourse. This means that the public is continuing to be pushed and to push its politicians further to the right. Recent polls among Israeli youth also suggest prominent support for discrimination of Palestinians, framed as a measure to safeguard Israeli Jewish hegemony, and increasing support for anti-Palestinian violence. It doesn't help that these teenagers themselves are unlikely to have ever met a Palestinian in the flesh, and that all the associations they inherit from their elder siblings or parents are likely to have been shaped by the Second Intifada. This gap between a right-wing government and an ever more right-wing and impatient public opinion helps spur events like the murderous attack on the village of Duma. One of the most worrying developments of the last year has been the growing specter of grassroots violence, quite beyond the control of the Israeli government, however much it might be clinging to the status quo. Last year, the murders of Mohammed Abu Khdel and the 3 Israeli teenagers brought tensions on all sides of the Green Line, close to a point of the worst of communal clashes. Yugoslavia in the 90s and Kenya in 2000 repeatedly came to mind of many there this summer. Last year, the eruption of grassroots violence culminated in a new war on Gaza. This year, we seem to have been spared, not least thanks to Palestinian restraint, but no one can tell us how the next summer will look like. This also helps explain the very panicked reaction of the Israeli government to settler violence, expanding some of the tools of the occupation onto some of the settler communities, such as administrative detention and so on. Well, it's true that no meaningful diplomatic price has been exacted from Israel for nearly 50 years of occupation. It's not likely to remain the same. I'm sure I don't need to elaborate on the erosion of uncritical support for Israel in the United States, both among the general public and among American Jews. And the contrast between the Israeli talk and the Israeli walk is beginning to grade also across the pond. There is increasing thinking in Europe about how to bring European decision-making in line with Europe's state policy of opposition to the settlement project. This possibility is being taken quite seriously by the Israeli business elites, if not the political ones. A recent paper by my think tank, CFR, which suggested that the European banks inquire of Israeli banks concerning their investments in the settlement economy, sent the shares of all Israeli banks plummeting, and elicited dire predictions from various leaders of the finance industry. So, where do we go from here? Without making a caveat on the caveat, in the near term, nowhere in particular. All my interviews among Israeli policymakers for this paper and party functionaries suggested there's neither desire nor vision to rock the boat in any particular way or any particular direction. To borrow from Mandy's presentation, there is certainly no official plan B. The most prominently aired alternative visions from outside government also seek to tweak rather than challenge the status quo. The Confederation vision, which we've heard from both groups of Israeli intellectuals and from some of the architects of Oslo, like Yossi Beilin, suggests a more equitable and looser form of partition based on the temporary institutions of Oslo, but fails to offer Israelis any reason to take even the reduced risks that this program would entail. Right-wing annexationist suggestions, while offering curious solutions to the question of Palestinian citizenship, does not overall significantly challenge the status quo either, nor should it be expected to. In the long run, however, this emerging non-partitionist discourse still has a role to play when and if the status quo is made or becomes untenable. It's highly unlikely that any form of constructive partition will still be possible at this stage. It certainly doesn't seem possible now, and it is unclear how much of Oslo institutions will remain in the long run. As things are going now, when the debate opens up once more, the question itself will likely be a different one. Oslo has been defined by the question of how to separate. A future debate might be more concerned with how to actually live together. And at least this sounds too idyllic, let me translate that question to the challenges both communities will face. And I'm borrowing the examples from a recent talk by Palestinian political scientist Raif Zrek at Brown University. Israelis will need to answer the question of how to maintain a national identity while giving up the hegemony they've become used to seeing as tantamount to survival. Palestinians will have to confront the question of whether, how, and when can a settler become a native. But before we even get to asking these questions, we still have a very long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dimi. And now Tawfiq will present. So I'm not sure if because of the slides you will stay there or not. So. No, he's still there. Okay, so thank you for that. If we lose you, we will connect with you on the Q&A session. And for now, we have another paper presented by Dr. Tawfiq Haddad. Tawfiq recently completed his PhD from at SOAS in development studies as well. He's a researcher, writer, editor, and consultant. In 2007, he co-edited the volume Between the Lines, Readings on Israel, the Palestinians, and the U.S. War on Terror. And early next year, his forthcoming book will be, which is based on his PhD thesis, will be published, and looking forward to read it on, and it's entitled Palestine Limited, Neoliberalism and National Liberation in the OPT. And the occupied Palestinian territory. So Tawfiq, you have around 20 minutes. I'm looking forward for you.
Thank you. Hello. All right. Okay. My singing voice is back. About 3 days ago, the International Crisis Group came out with a new report on the situation in Gaza, in which it outlined the sort of catastrophic conditions that Gaza exists in today. I'm going to start off with sort of naming some of those conditions, or sort of outlining some of them, and then begin to use those to speak about how we actually approach the situation of Gaza. So it actually noted in the report, it said that conditions in Gaza are the worst since Israel has conquered the territory in 1967, which is actually saying a lot. It described a situation where 100,000 people are still homeless, residing in temporary accommodation or tents, crammed with families. Up until June, this past June, more than 5,000 people were living in temporary shelters. and UN schools. Around 23 million tons of construction materials were needed for Gaza to complete infrastructure and other projects to repair the damage, but less than 6% of that has actually entered the strips over the past year. Gaza today has the highest unemployment of any economy in the world, 41%, and has about 60% of youth unemployment. 80% of the population relies upon donor aid. 39% is below the poverty line. 57% are food insecure. Electricity shortages are common, up to 16 hours a day. 95% of the water in Gaza's aquifer is unfit for humans, and in a few years, almost all of it will be. The remaining 5% will be out. And water-related diseases account for 1/4 of illnesses. And for the first time in 5 decades, the infant mortality rate has begun to rise. So it paints a pretty horrific picture of the situation in Gaza today. Now, this is quite a typical sort of way that talks on Gaza tend to begin. A situation of crisis and trauma, and of course these are all very warranted, but the situation of crisis in Gaza can't just be left as a sort of statistical toll of misery. When the Israeli human rights organization Gisha, which monitors things that enter the movement of trade into Gaza, forced the Israeli military to disclose how the pattern of how it allowed shipments into Gaza, it basically revealed that the Israeli military practiced with a sense of rational planning. They actually calculated exactly how many kilos of lentils and rice and basic foodstuffs should be allowed into Gaza so that the population there does not starve. So this gave evidence of a sense of rational planning to the situation in Gaza. From every lentil to every bunker buster which enters Gaza with precision, there is some form of plan, some form of thinking that is going on. And what I wanted to look into my paper was to what end. Few researchers, journalists, and politicians seem to inquire as to the reasons behind these policies, leaving a muddy rhetorical variant of the war on terror to dominate. Hamas is generally seen as being an irreformable Islamist political movement bent on Israel's destruction, even if the movement is seen to be resisting oppressive conditions of occupation and besiegement. Israel, on the other hand, is generally portrayed as engaging in acts of self-defense to Hamas's provocations that, even if morally justifiable, may utilize excessive force. Increasingly fewer governments appear to challenge what should be done about it in either case. I would like to argue, and what my paper argues, is that this is a reductionist and ahistorical reading of the situation. That is to say that Israel's policies vis-a-vis Gaza are not primarily motivated by efforts at self-defense, nor are they merely vindictive or whimsically destructive. Instead, they flow from a long-standing set of policies activated through political and economic measures to reach particular aims. Moreover, Western donor governments, through their withholding or provision of aid, are active and not just passive parties to this arrangement. While the results produced on the ground may not always conform to intentions or design, the architecture of asymmetric power relations between the Palestinians and Israel and the donor community unquestionably leverage and shape Gaza's material and immaterial realities. So my paper essentially explores the workings of this logic, reinserting considerations of power and politics into Gaza's dehumanizing statistical toll. It attempts to situate Gaza's conditions within the broader historical and political struggle between Palestinian national liberation movement on the one hand, and Israel and its Western political allies on the other. It furthermore raises questions as to how Gaza's state of crisis is both deliberate and deliberately generated to affect various sections of Gaza's society differently, and how these differences are used to influence the internal balance of power within Gazan society and the overall set of relations between Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel. Why is Gaza's perpetual predicament that of crisis? What generates this perennial state more than 20 years after Oslo? How do political, economic, and social actors in Gaza negotiate these conditions? How have these waves of recurring crisis influenced or transformed social relations between actors and groups? And what are the implications of these transformations on the overall Palestinian national movement? Slide 2. Now, I promised Mandy, and I was given firm instructions that I'm not allowed to give big general. I'm supposed to focus on the new things about Gaza, okay? But I actually think this sense of disaggregating the Palestinian question is part of the mentality and logic that reproduces this the situation where we got to today. So, forgive me for taking a few moments to sort of take a step back and attempt to speak of objective factors situating Gaza into a larger balance that begins to sort of peck away at the logic that I described at the beginning. This is a map of Gaza. These are certain basic factors about Gaza that are incontrovertible, I would argue. Its demographic composition is largely composed of refugees. 3/4 of the population of Gaza are refugees. This reverses the demographic composition of the West Bank, which is roughly, so 75% are refugees in Gaza, whereas the West Bank, about I believe it's around 75% also, are actually from villages inside the West Bank itself, this domestic base. Also, Gaza was the only city, and is the largest urban center, Palestinian urban center, and it was the only major urban center to survive after 1948. Okay? Political factors. It has been historically the crucible of Palestinian nationalism and of resistance. Obviously, a very sort of natural emergence from its political background and historical background. It has also been the focus of Israeli repression, and I would also argue one that is poorly reported on. Few people, for instance, know the fact that the largest single massacre to take place in Palestine took place in Gaza in Khan Yunis in 1956, where more than 500 Palestinians were killed by going door to door, pulling men out of their houses and shooting them. Until a few years ago, no one even knew of this massacre. And still today, even though there's a lot more reporting on Gaza, the truth of the reality of Gaza and its history is not known. And the fact is, even in this paper that I'm presenting, anyone who tells you they know the situation in Gaza is lying to you. There's a lot of it cannot be known, okay? And that's partially from the siege, but partially because a lot of it is underground and we don't know, but we can discern things. Anyway, there's obviously geostrategic factors that are incontrovertible. It's access to the sea, trade routes. It has the potential to have trade independently without going through Israel. Obviously, it's not very far from the Suez Canal either. In 1998, British Petroleum discovered natural gas reserves off of the Gaza Strip. There are also geological factors, its own limited landmass and its water security perennially create situations of the territory's self-sufficiency. Finally, there are social factors such as its historical, economic, and familiar connections to Arabs in the north of the Sinai, as well as the Negev. These are all incontrovertible facts about Gaza which pre-exist any political context of what Gaza is, who rules Gaza. And that's quite important because they all have very important implications on the way Israel deals with it. I want to contrast this incontrovertible reality with also some general factors on the Israeli side. That being one, now I don't have very much time to go into it here, but one being general contradiction between Zionism and Palestinian nationalism. This is not something that I need to particularly make an argument about. Israelis historically, Israeli political and military leaders have made this, but essentially it derives from the fact that Israel is the state of the Jewish people in the world, not of its citizens. Okay? Therefore, any other population which claims national rights to that land undermines that claim. Secondly, there's an internal Zionist contradiction in regards to the Jewish democratic state. And this was obviously made much worse after the 1967 occupation, when more than 1 million Palestinians came to be under the control of Israel. If Israel gave this population citizenship, it would erode its Jewish character. If it did not give them citizenship, it would erode their democratic character. The policy results of this, as they were played out eventually, have been described in different ways. But Ari Arnon, who's an Israeli economist, described it well when he talked about Israel having to have a neither two nor one policy, in effect, meaning that Israel could not take policies vis-a-vis the LPT that led to integration, but it also could not step back and allow for the Palestinian areas that existed to create the nucleus of something that could be a national project. This later on became known and formulated in what was known as the Alon Plan, which is the key plan which has set the framework for all future plans. I would argue, and it hasn't been talked about too much today, but I would argue the entire Oslo process has been the manifestation of some form of the Alon Plan, which essentially had it that Israel would solve this problem by withdrawing from the dense concentrations of Palestinian areas, giving them some form of self-governance, usually through a proxy party. Initially, it was thought of Jordan and Egypt would play this role. Eventually, the PLO came to be that party that would play that role. So a form of subcontracting of the occupation. This argument has been made by several people before. I'm not going to go into it now. I'm going to jump in a bit. But simply to stop right here, if you put slide 1 and slide 2 together, or the last 2 slides together, essentially you have a zero-sum game. Okay? Like if there's the situation in Gaza continually generates nationalist demands, rights of return, everything about national self-determination. Israel is categorically opposed to this. So one wins or one loses. And that's essentially the framework in which exists, certainly from a Zionist perspective. It also means from a Zionist perspective that Israel needs to be proactive and undertake preventative approaches, what it would call, because it cannot simply step back and allow for the Palestinians to create some sort of base. That's all the general history and political stuff that I'm going to talk about. Keep it in your mind as we now skip 20 years later, almost, to the last period in which we are today. Now, I don't have time to talk about how we actually got to this period, although the paper does go to this, but go through this. But essentially, we're fast forwarding to trying to understand the pulse of Gaza today. Understanding the pulse of Gaza today necessitates understanding basically the post-2007 period and the transformations that have come about. It begins with understanding that after Hamas came into power, of course, you had the imposition of a siege, and then, of course, the latest from July, after the events in Egypt in July 2013, where SCAF essentially takes over and pushes aside the Muslim Brotherhood, it imposes a closure on Gaza's southern border. Okay, so this essentially is what we are witnessing today is part of the arc of the rise and fall of the tunnel economy in Gaza. Now, so this is how we must politically, economically, and socially understand, so we understand where things are going to. Understanding the rise of the tunnel economy, as I said, it's a very difficult thing to study, but actually there was a very good study done by the United Nations on this, but it actually was buried. People don't realize that, and the results of this study were actually published by Nicholas Pelham, who is the journalist who writes for The Economist. And he took some of the best results of that study and published them in an article from the Journal of Palestine Studies because it wasn't published. And you'll understand why it was not published after I tell you, after I go through some of what that study actually said. So, essentially, after the siege was imposed, this led to natural conditions where a tunnel economy emerged in Gaza to help meet local needs. By the eve of Operation Cast Lead, Israel's in December 2008, there were at least 500 tunnels, transforming the situation from what had been $30 million trade annually through these tunnels into a situation of $36 million monthly. Okay, Hamas formalized the trade business. It created in the Interior Ministry, establishing the Ministry of Tunnel Affairs Commission. It regulated trade, arbitrated disputes, taxed and monitored the market, levied customs. In 1998, before everything, trade was 99% to 1 Israel, non-Israel. By 2008, that was entirely reversed. Okay? So keep it in mind, very important. Within 2 years, capacity had increased tenfold. In 2010, tunnels improved in quality and quantity, moving 170 metric tons of raw material a day. Prices fell. Turkish cement went from $1,500 a ton to $100. Shipping costs went down. After the destruction of cast lead, Gaza was essentially reconstructed itself via the tunnels. This is very important. There was there was no real international donors who came into the picture. Gaza, through the tunnel economy, did that. It's a very important fact to keep in mind. Even the World Bank itself was later, in 2011, forced to acknowledge that Gaza witnessed exceptionally high growth as a result of the tunnel economy, notching up 28% GDP, which put to shame what was happening in the West Bank. Eventually, Israel, after the Mavi Marmara affair, was forced to began to allow forms of trade to come into Gaza, where forcing the specialization of the tunnels. Israel's blacklist became the smugglers' green list. To sum it all up, the tunnel economy was essentially Gaza's largest non-governmental employer. It was the largest employer of youth overall. It attracted and absorbed the construction workers that used to work in Israel. It employed upwards of 30,000 people. Tunnels outcompeted the previous commercial avenues that used to be controlled by Israel. It subverted or circumvented the Paris Protocol, which we heard from Raja today. It allowed for Gaza's commercial ties with Egypt to be reestablished, sidelined Gaza's traditional mercantile elite, which formed a crucial basis of the Fatah political economic order. It gave rise to a new generation of smugglers who derive from different familial and geographic orientations within the strip. Tunnels became a key driver of upward mobility and social change, empowering previously marginalized groups as well as a new class of nouveau riche. Essentially, the Gaza tunnel trade exposed the illegitimacy and punitive nature of the siege, the bureaucracy of importation that Israel oversaw through the Paris Protocol, and the politically conditioned nature of aid and the complicity of Western donors in that arrangement. That is the context which today is in great retreat. Okay, the fall of the Gaza tunnel trade. 30,000 people were put out of work, and what we will begin to look at is some of the downfall effects of this. These are some images of that. The image on the left is actually from a Palestinian Authority publication, which talks of 600 new millionaires in Gaza. And if you actually read the article from the tunnel trade, read the article, it's filled with vitriol against the rise of a new economic class. Sort of the other picture I think I found quite touching, sort of intimate moment inside the tunnels, where obviously youth sort of smoke and work in silence and in darkness. The imposition of both siege and warfare was clearly targeted destruction of productive sectors. This is very clearly seen in things like the fishing industry. The last war, 58 boats were destroyed. You see the chart on the bottom shows Israeli attacks against Palestinian fishermen just up until May. It shows that 14 fishermen have been killed. There have been 81 incidences of firing, dozens of incidences of the damaging of fishing equipment or whatnot. The map to the left shows the historical, how Israel moved methodically and historically to limit the area within which Gaza could actually fish for itself. 5 minutes left? Come on. Okay, I'm on slide 8, I've got 17.
No, it's not going to work.
Okay. Huh?
It's not going to work.
Not
8
gonna-
slides and 7.
You're going to see? No, you'll see.
5 minutes.
Okay, don't worry, we're all good. Okay, this image I brought in just to show how, even in the context where destruction of productive capacities took place, you have when donors move in to help, supposedly. This is a fish farm in the Mawasi area near Rafah, it actually, instead of challenging Israel's closure policies and access to the sea, it actually works to create new economies inside where, so Palestinians don't need to access the sea anymore. We see, of course, the once important manufacturing sector has shrunk by 60%. A third of agriculture area was destroyed during the war. In 2005, exports used to be 9,300 trucks a day. In 2014, there were 136 trucks that were allowed export. This shows, the image shows tile factories. 30 tile factories have closed, some of them selling off their machinery as scrap metal. Those who have survived have turned into traders. The same goes for the welding industry. About 6,000 metal workshops have been closed, with 20,000 employees, all showing destructive of productive capacity. There has also been the rise of new economic actors as trade eclipses production. Initially, when the siege first came into, the price of a donkey raised to 700 Jordanian dinars because it was the only means of transportation. After the tunnels and after they began bringing even cars through the tunnels, there was a what's it called? A glut? No, the opposite. A flush of cars. And this is an article on the right-hand side speaking of 20,000 car drivers in Gaza. 12,000 private cars are used by Gazans as taxis, as their second and third forms of employment. According to the head of the Gaza Taxi Drivers Union, Gaza only needs 3,000 cars. This shows one of the tunnels and how serious the tunnel industry was at its height. It is also from a Palestinian Authority publication. It says, مذبحة جماعية, a collective slaughter of the importers of cars, because it illustrates the extent to which Gaza importers of cars who had gained the agency from the Palestinian Authority and were invariably associated with Fatah, they were the main ones hit by this. And they're the ones who, by the rise of new import traders. Quotation from Ibrahim Nakhle, head of the Association of Car Importers: the traders who benefit from the ministerial decision to allow the import of cars are the same traders who built a new empire. We, the official traders, are not benefiting. The Hamas public relations ministry spokesman from the Ministry of Transport and Communications retorted that they were retorted on the basis that they were liberalizing the market and that they were doing this on the basis of free market capitalism. It's true. You see the rise of new recycling and new economic actors. This is a second-hand market, clothing market that has also hit some of the established traders. Overall, however, when we begin to bring now politics into this, we speak of a veritable crisis of liquidity in Gaza, especially on the government levels, which has led Hamas to begin to challenge, seek new sources of revenue, now that things have been closed off, and in addition to the complications of the politics and economics of the Arab revolutionary problems going on with Iran and Syria, etc. So this has forced Hamas to look for new forms of income and begin to challenge some of the corporations and elites who were benefiting under the old arrangement. So on the left-hand side is the largest Palestinian private sector corporation, Jawal, the telephone company. Sometimes it contributed up to 10% of Palestinian GDP, made $130 million in profits, 40% of its profits coming from Gaza. But that tax has not been going to Gaza, it has been going to the West Bank. And that's where the problem lies. Gaza has its eyes on trying to get those. It has set its eyes on 13 main companies in Gaza who work collectively between two. Many of them banks, including on the right side, the Bank of Palestine. It shows demonstrations in front of it. The banking sector obviously has cut out Hamas. So these are widows and orphans and people who used to receive charitable things through the banking sector that the Bank of Palestine has now cut off. Essentially, the total amount and Gaza actually has a very strong case. It claims that, where we stand? About 3 minutes? Oh, great. Okay. The total amount that the PA gains in income from Gaza taxes, in addition to entitlements from foreign grants, according to the budget of 2014, amounts to $1.5 billion. Okay, so of which 900 million is spent in Gaza. So the PA actually only spends 22% in Gaza. It claims it spends 47%, only spends 22%, and there is a surplus of around $570 million that is entitled to Gaza that Gaza can't get. And Gaza wants that money and needs that money to be able to pay its personnel. Collectively, this raises the issue of taxation without representation. And it also raises the issue of donor oversight, because essentially donors after 2002 became the auditors and accountants of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. So they equally are complicit in this arrangement. This is some clippings from the Hamas press. I only show it here to sort of show how this process after has the roots of the economic crisis are leading to elements of polarization. Essentially, the one on the right speaks to how Gaza's money, stolen money, is the real reason behind why Abu Mazen is against reconciliation. The image on the left shows that it essentially portrays the Palestinian Authority as trying to leech onto reconstruction money for its ends, and Qatar stands up against this. So, the larger argument I'm making is coming down to reconciliation or polarization, which is actually symbolized or crystallizing around the issue of reconstruction. Palestinian government of national consensus was technically formed in June 2014, just before Operation Protective Edge. And I would argue it is one of the main targets of why the war took place. Okay. However, after the war and the crisis of liquidity, essentially the Palestinian Authority retreat. The sense of polarization emerged, and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank reshuffled the cabinet and dropped all pretenses of any consensus without Hamas insight into the affair. This has resulted in a three-way chicken and egg situation around the issue of reconstruction. Donors are not giving funds, claiming that they want the Palestinian Authority to be in control of the process. The Palestinian Authority, or Fatah, doesn't want to take over Gaza in a partial way. It is also knows that it is weak there. Hamas has refused to give up security coordination, security control of Gaza. It also is expensive to take control of Gaza. And furthermore, it does not want to tie its fate to that of Hamas if repressive measures Israel decides to take are undertaken. Because once a national consensus government happens, Israel, the Palestinian Authority and its investments in the West Bank equally become on the hook. But Hamas will not allow a partial PA return unless there is full implementation and implementation of the conciliation accord, which calls for holistic reforms across the board. This has, of course, donors could give directly, but they don't trust the situation. And anyway, internally, according to the ICG report, the offer money supposedly given for Gaza's reconstruction, a good deal of it was not even, a good deal of it was already paid out during the war, and there was no serious commitment to actually back it up. This effectively punishes Gaza for being under Hamas and being an extension of Israel's siege. Now, I'm going to stop here on this because I basically come up of it, but there was a whole section on social transformation that you're going to miss out on, which speaks of the phenomena of collective marriages, which is quite fascinating, and how this whole situation of crisis actually plays into Hamas's hands and strengthens Hamas from the base. But I don't have time to go into that. I also go into leisure. I won't go into that. But bring it back to some concluding remarks.
In 1 minute, please, Dr.
In 1 minute, no worries. Today, Gaza is a portrait of sociocide, a portrait of also politicide, I would argue. The situation is catastrophic, as we said, but essentially the crisis of war, which Israel determined by itself one day when there was a random attack that took place in the West Bank. They decided to attack Hamas in Gaza. They took the initiative to create a crisis in a political context where they knew there was a siege coming from the Egyptian side as well, where Gaza could not reconstruct, created a crisis of liquidity, in addition to the political crisis and division that previously existed. This helped to create conditions and entrench a system of divide and rule. And that's why, that is the larger picture. That is why you cannot look at Gaza in isolation from itself. It is, they have created, the dynamics and the contradictions of the system have created two sets of institutions, two sets of legitimacy, two political tracks, two strategies, two sets of tactics, two financial streams, and both are independent on different geographical territories. It's fundamentally a policy of divide and rule, and I would argue collectively that this is also an attempt to reverse history, a form of reversal of history in the sense that the creation of the PLO was one of the most important creations of the modern Palestinian national movement, a collective framework within which Palestinian issues could be addressed. Today that is in danger, and that is the result of, that is, I think, how we should come to understand Gaza today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tawfiq, for a very passionate presentation. You went definitely over time. I was very generous with you. So now, last but not least, our final speaker, Dr. Shireen Hussain. She's currently a research fellow at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs in Stockholm. And she was until recently the deputy director and research fellow at the Kenyon Institute in Jerusalem. Shireen will try to tell us all about the single state as an alternative to Oslo. I'm sorry that I will be strict. Another 20 minutes.
Like Tawfiq?
No, not like Tawfiq.
Like mine.
Like Tawfiq, like Rajab.
Self-imposed.
Thank you all for coming and for lasting this long. I'm not sure how I can talk about something so hopeful after Tawfiq. But it's a pleasure for me to be here to talk a little about my work on the one democratic state alternative in Palestine as a Gramscian-inspired movement of counter-hegemonic resistance to Oslo. This presentation is partly based on my book that just came out called The Reemergence of the Single-State Solution in Palestine-Israel, and on the never-ending conversations I kept having with myself on Gramscian counter-hegemony during my PhD years, the often overlooked significance of material territoriality within it, and on whether or not intellectuals can actually build mass political movements for social transformation. As a fan of the creation of critical theory, though, I'm also very happy to be here as part of a project that aims at igniting academic conversations on Israel and Palestine since the Oslo Accords that are not based within disciplinary debates that center upon an abstracted peace process, but that begin from within the messy realities and geographies of both the continuously transforming land itself and the struggles and imaginings of the future of the people who presently inhabit it. It's within the highlighting of these transformations and contradictions and from within these human points of beginnings that I think we all believe more hopeful pathways for alternative ways forwards can be collectively imagined, debated, and built. So I'm going to begin my presentation by giving you a brief snapshot of the reemergence of the single democratic state solution as a movement of counter-hegemonic resistance to the paradigms of Oslo, while outlining its intellectual worldview as well as the prominent role of the Palestinian diaspora within it. The second part of my presentation is very much work in progress and is based upon recent and ongoing interviews with Palestinian and Jewish Israeli intellectuals and activists who support a single democratic state solution in some form or another and live in Palestine, Israel, and paints an interlinked but slightly different, fragmented, and at times demoralizing picture of divisions, lack of leadership, or perhaps just pessimism of both the intellect and the will. The aim in presenting this same movement of resistance from within diverse geographies is to eventually be able to map Palestinian agency across diverse terrains and ask what strategies are working, for who are they working, and how can everyone involved move forward from here. So the single-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict re-emerged largely as an academic debate centered on a critique of Oslo and driven by a number of prominent Palestinian and Israeli intellectuals. Re-emerging in the aftermath of the principle and processes of separation embraced and worsened by the Oslo Accords, this phenomenon of resistance seeks to highlight the failure of Arafat's strategy to create a viable two-state solution from within the paradigms of Oslo, and the expansion of the processes of Zionism on the land despite the existence of the American-sponsored peace process. In doing so, it strives to reformulate Palestinian resistance into a collective struggle that opposes Zionism and separation, is relocated within a framework of international law, universal human rights, and citizenship for all, and is based within the political desire to both reunite the Palestinian national collective and bring about a single-state solution to the conflict built upon a vision of equal citizenship, democracy, and the sharing of the land among all of its inhabitants. Painted and dismissed by many as a utopian academic exercise, my work seeks to take a different path, inquiring into the nature of the single-state alternative as a movement of resistance. In doing this, though, I discovered that the decentralization and many diverse personalities with uncoordinated actions involved in the broader picture of the single-state project makes it difficult to decipher as a phenomenon that resembles any traditional view of what a movement looks like. Instead, I found that a more accurate reflection of the dynamics, shifts, and strategies of this movement emerged when viewing it through a Gramscian-inspired lens, one that centers on the revolutionary power of philosophy and the natural link between thought and action in building a new collective force against a particular status quo. In view of this, my work argues this and presents this alternative in terms of what Gramsci defined as a philosophical movement, one that begins a struggle of resistance in the realm of ideas. As such, I argue that the single-state alternative is a movement that is centered on the launching of a project of critical education by intellectuals within their own communities in order to change the common sense ideas linking them to an oppressive status quo and a process of mutual transformation and empowerment. This process itself is argued to revolutionize political possibilities on the ground and is reflected in Ilan Pape's assertion that while the current two-state solution needs politicians, the single-state solution needs educators, and involves the launching of a long-term process of resistance aimed at decolonization, liberation, and empowerment. So what are the common sense ideas of the Oslo Accords that single-state intellectuals argue that they are struggling to change among both their own people and the international community? The first of these revolves around the accepted idea that Oslo represents the launching of a process of peace. So it's important to stress that for single-state intellectuals, the peace process since Oslo does not reflect the launching of a comprehensive process for peace based on the desire for justice and reconciliation, but a process of separation and fragmentation. This is due to the Accord's choice of historical point of beginning. For beginning the peace process in 1967 as opposed to 1948 results in the erasure of the Palestinian Negba and absolving Israel of any responsibility for the ethnic cleansing of 1948, and as such enclosing a significant door for justice and reconciliation between the two people. Beginning the peace process in 1967 also denies Palestinian history and rights to self-determination by setting the occupied Palestinian territories as the only territorial part of historical Palestine on which negotiations can be held. Thus, the peace process involved negotiations that would lead to further territorial concessions and fragmentation within the West Bank and Gaza Strip from its start. By erasing 1948, it was also based on the fragmentation of the Palestinian collective from its beginning, excluding both the Palestinians inside Israel and the Palestinian refugees from the negotiating table. As such, the single-state movement is an effort to relocate the search for peace and justice between Israelis and Palestinians in 1948, and crucially represents a force that seeks to reunify the Palestinian collective around an idea that serves the rights and aspirations of everybody. In parallel to this, single-state intellectuals argue that it is only by beginning in 1948 that true processes of justice and reconciliation can be launched between the two people. The second common sense idea struggled against by the single state movement revolves around the accepted notion that Oslo marks the beginning of a process towards a two-state solution. While Oslo was applauded by the international community as the beginning of a two-state solution to the conflict, single-state intellectuals argue that it represented the launching and worsening of Zionist processes of separation and colonization on the land. These processes themselves, which have famously been argued by Edward Said and more recently by Tawfiq to represent a modified Alon plan, can be summarized in Amnon Raz's words on the motivation behind Rabin's recognition of the PLO at the time, in which he stated, Rabin was a follower of Yigal Allon, who after the 1967 war outlined a plan according to which the District of Jerusalem, as well as parts of the Hebron district and the Jordan Valley, would be kept under Israeli sovereignty. The remaining territory would become an autonomous Palestinian area with a link to Jordan. Rabin considered the Oslo framework to be one which would enable him to achieve via different tactics the policy he had always favored. As such, it's important to note that single-state intellectuals view the fact that the peace process is officially accepted as one that will lead to a two-state solution as both a misnaming of the two-state solution itself and as a deflection from the realities within Israel-Palestine that have made a two-state solution territorially and economically unviable. These realities, of course, include the immovable obstacle of the expanding settlements. In parallel to this, single-state intellectuals view the concessions made by Arafat in order to be able to return to the occupied Palestinian territories and launch a war of position from within it as the beginning of the emergence of a Palestinian Authority that was placed in an inevitable position of collaboration with Israeli occupation while simultaneously having sidelined Palestinian popular resistance. Thus, the single-state movement is an attempt at reigniting non-violent Palestinian mass resistance to the continuing processes of colonization on the land, as well as a call for both reformulating the PA and redemocratizing the PLO into an organization that represents and reunifies the whole Palestinian collective. The third commonly accepted idea the single-state alternative takes issue with is the idea that the Palestinian Authority represents the Palestinian people. For, they argue, it was only Arafat and his small entourage in Tunis who were involved in the acceptance of the terms of the Oslo Accords on behalf of the PLO, which resulted in a crisis of representation within the Palestinian National Collective, as well as a questioning of the legitimacy of a leadership that viewed the internationally recognized rights of its people as bargaining chips that could be compromised. Thus, at the SOAS One-State Conference, Joseph Massad famously stated, to date, no diaspora Palestinian has proposed to Israel that if Israel grant the diaspora a right of return, in exchange it could deny West Bank and Gaza Palestinians their right to self-determination and continue to colonize their land. Why then does the leadership of the West Bank believe that it can compromise the rights of Palestinians it does not even represent? In accepting the terms of Oslo and after, the PLO officially accepted the fragmentation of the Palestinian people and the erasure of the rights of the Palestinian diaspora, the refugees, and Palestinian Israelis. In this vein, then, only native West Bank and Gaza Strip Palestinians would be set to benefit from within the peace process. However, single-state intellectuals point out that even these Palestinians' lives have been made significantly worse by the processes of Oslo, with the only hope awaiting them being an apartheid Bantustan solution. It's from within this context that single-state intellectuals seek to throw the PA into the dustbin of history and to redemocratize the PLO. More significantly, it's also from within this context that the single-state movement can be seen as one initially launched as a war of position of the Palestinian diaspora, the refugees, and Palestinian Israelis. As reflected in the One-State Declaration, it is those who have been historically silenced by the Oslo Accords who must now become central agents in the mobilization and creation of a more just alternative to the status quo. Interestingly, in practice, while it was Palestinian Israelis who were originally acknowledged to have been the central energy behind the reemergence of the single-state idea, it's the Palestinian diaspora who have been and continue to be its fastest growth force. And for those interested in more details on this and on the link between single-state intellectuals and the emergence of the anti-apartheid paradigm, the apartheid paradigm, and the global BDS movement, maybe we can talk about it after the panel. But I'd like to quickly point out, though, that there are several other intellectual strategies of resistance that have emerged from within the single-state movement's critique of Oslo, all of which I argue have been successful at changing people's conceptions, especially in the West, on what is possible and desirable as linked to solutions to this conflict. The most important of these include the move to emphasize the distinction between Judaism and political Zionism, and to break the taboo on criticizing Zionism in the West, and the move to South Africanize the conflict in order to provide a more accurate lens into Israel's form of settler colonialism on the land, especially for American publics, and to advocate a rights-based approach to ending the conflict that is based in international law. In the words of George Bisharat, for example, one of the reasons that the anti-apartheid movement in the US reached such heights was because it resonated with the American civil rights movement. Unfortunately, that's not the way Israel-Palestine reads to Americans. If you talk to Americans about settlers or settlements, some of them actually have a positive connotation of that because it reminds them of the American West and pioneering settlers. Apartheid, however, they all know that apartheid is bad. They all respond to it. So yes, I think that analogy is a valuable tool. And it's not just a valuable tool, it's accurate. Described by Omar Barghouti as a three-tiered form of apartheid, this Israeli form of domination is argued to include the occupation and colonization of the 1967 territory, the system of racial discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel, which is the Zionist form of apartheid, and the total denial of refugee rights, particularly the right to return home and to reparations. Okay, and due to lack of time, I want to quickly take you all from kind of this hopeful and place of momentum that I've argued is being built around the single-state alternative in mainly geographical places linked to the international, to the situation now, and a small collection of the contradictory themes that have emerged among single democratic state supporters who inhabit the contested land itself, in the words of those intellectuals and activists themselves, while they were reflecting on why there are still no significant signs of a grassroots movement being built for a one-state solution on the ground. For example, while of course their worldviews, principles, and strategies are part of the same project described above, there is a much more prominent and strategically debilitating divide between single-staters in Palestine-Israel who favor binationalism, the majority of whom are Jewish Israelis and Palestinian citizens of Israel, versus Palestinians in the West Bank who favor a secular one-person, one-vote democracy. In the words of one intellectual, for example, I'll be very honest, the divide is between Zionists versus anti-Zionists, and I'm sorry to say that some Palestinians have been Zionized. Some Palestinians are using terms such as self-determination to describe the rights of Jewish colonizers in Palestine, which is incredible to me. How can the indigenous accept the idea of colonizers having equal national rights? Equal rights, yes, I support that, but national rights is not acceptable. In my opinion, the binational solution is a Zionist solution. Similarly, in the words of a single-state intellectual in Ramallah, on whether or not prominent anti-Zionist one-state Jewish intellectuals are part of their movement, like some well-known anti-Zionist Jewish intellectuals, they said, technically they are, but we have a bit of a divide with them because they support binationalism. The problem with binationalism is that it takes us back to two states and the principle of self-determination. If we support binationalism, we are effectively saying that each nation has the right to have an independent state and giving our colonizers national rights which they are not entitled to. So the democratic solution is more ideal, and it doesn't negate anyone's identity. On the other hand, most Palestinian Israeli intellectuals support binationalism due to both their fear of being engulfed in a single Islamic state and their argument that Jewish Israelis would initially never accept any other form of a shared democracy, while a very well-known Jewish single-state intellectual argued that secularism is a European Orientalist ideology. It is a form of racism. I have no interest in living in a secular state, but I want to live in a democracy, and I don't equate the two. These divides are exacerbated by calls from many Jewish Israeli single-state activists that Palestinian one-staters, especially Palestinian Israelis, need to speak to the Jewish public and articulate to them what their rights would be in a democratic Palestine in order for the movement to be able to move forward. While many Palestinian activists, notably those based in Jerusalem and the West Bank, argue that Jewish Israelis who choose to coexist with Palestinian communities instead of working to change the common sense perceptions of their own publics and communities are simply choosing the easy way out and shooting the movement's strategy in the foot. The aftermath of the Arab uprisings, especially in Egypt, has also had a generally negative effect on the momentum of the single-state alternative inside Palestine-Israel, and widened the gulf between the Palestinian diaspora, who still mainly argue that elements of Hamas should be included in their struggle as long as they agree to their one-state principles, and the majority of Palestinians in Palestine who have no desire to incorporate them. In the words of a West Bank-based activist, I think Joseph Mashad and Ali Abu Nama and the rest of the diaspora are getting disillusioned with Hamas. Things we have been saying since the 90s, they are discovering them now. We here on the ground, we know Hamas. They are no revolutionaries. Egypt, Tunisia, anyone who had the illusion that they can ever evolve into a revolutionary party doesn't understand the very ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's about social repression, cultural repression, and taking over. They are interested in taking power, not in revolution, not in radical change of any sort. On top of that, they are neoliberals too, especially the Ikhwan of Egypt. And while I could go on and on, I'd like to... How am I doing for time?
2 minutes.
Oh, okay, fine. I'd like to quickly point out that there are 4 things no one disagrees on in terms of strategy. And they are the need to abolish the PA in order to be able to move forward, and to gradually abolish the PA in order to be able to move forward. The Palestinian right of return as a crucial litmus test of anti-Zionism and alliance creation within the movement itself. The importance of supporting BDS as a non-violent and unifying struggle of collective resistance, as well as the important role youth movements have played in the past year or two in activism that has erased the Green Line and united the Palestinian collective in Palestine again, especially with regards to activism against the power plant in the Nakba. However, this momentum always stops short of translating into political gains for unity, justice, or democracy because of a general vacuum of alternative leadership. And with that, I'd like to wrap up with a quote from 2 leading one-state intellectuals in the West Bank who argue that while there is a lot of support for a single democratic state solution right now, this support is not being translated into action because there is no leadership or political party for a single democratic state. They state, wherever we propose the idea of a one democratic state, we find supporters. The challenge we face, though, is one of organization. How do we organize our supporters effectively? There is no political party. There are no politicians for one state. We got very close, though. Before he passed away, Haidar Abdel-Shafi, one of the best Palestinian civic leaders, read the one-state declaration and called us. He said, I'm an old communist, and this is what we dreamt of, a democratic society for all with the refugees' right of return. I'm glad you're doing this work, and I want to support it politically and publicly. Then he sadly passed away. He would have been the only mainstream voice who would have helped in supporting one state. We don't have anyone now. Palestinian intellectuals on the outside are not very influential inside. They unfortunately do not carry much weight here, and we don't have any charismatic figures like an Edward Said, for example. And to bring things back full circle to the question of the tension within the role of intellectuals in building movements for political change while not being willing usually to dirty their hands in politics itself, I will completely end with a quote by Ali Abu Nama on the ambiguity of his role as a scholar activist within the single-state movement, in which he says, "Of course, it's a political act to speak publicly, and to advocate for any kind of program is a political act. But in what capacity am I doing it? As an individual, as an intellectual, as a representative of a group of people? I have no formal position. I have no formal mandate to speak for anyone except for myself. So what I'm saying is that it's an ambiguous role. I feel like people look to me as if I have some kind of position of leadership or authority to speak, but I'm very conscious that no one really put me in that position."